afternoon, everybody, and welcome to In the Zone with Rich Sutter and Pete Coles. Very, very excited to be back at home this week as we did our third show on the road, and it was a bit of a tough go. And I wanted to thank MV Pete for his display of skills on the road. Just amazing. His performance was terrific, and I just couldn't have got it done without him. And so to start off this show, we wanted to thank Pete as always, but really jump right into our Feed 'em Fish section, where we are going to talk about some coaching changes that have occurred this week. Very, very exciting time in the game of basketball. Some of these changes that have occurred are going to possibly alter the landscape of college basketball as we currently know it, and resurrect some teams that have been down for a very, very long time. So with that in mind, we'd like to start with St. John's, and what we'll do is we'll go through the school, we'll talk about the former coach that they had, why they no longer have him, and then talk about the new coach. But also, we're all going to assign a grade to the hire. We're going to look at the hire, see who they got, see who they could have had, and possibly assign a grade there. So I'm sure there's some athletic directors and some college presidents that are absolutely shaking in their boots today, waiting for their grades from In the Zone. So I wanted to start off with St. John's, Pete. We talked about this a little bit last week. And again, the college coaching business is full of flawed human beings. The college coaching business, just like any other business, is full of flawed human beings. Do we believe in redemption? Do we believe in forgiveness? I think in the coaching business, that gets a little bit overblown because we forgive the people that can really coach, and we don't forgive the guys who don't do so well. So there's a little bit of a slant there. But again, when we're talking about grading these hires, we're looking about what does this do for the program moving forward? Where has the program been, and what exactly is this going to mean for the student body, for the school, in terms of increased revenue, increased exposure? Go back to Doug Flutie when Doug Flutie made that amazing touchdown pass. Their enrollment went through the roof at Boston College. You can go back to Patrick Ewing's group at Georgetown and watch what happened with the enrollment at Georgetown, and it went absolutely through the roof. That accumulates to dollars, that accumulates to prestige for universities. So these hires are really important, and the schools go through, I would imagine, a process that we can describe a little bit here on the show, but I don't want to get too in depth with. But the process now for selecting these coaches is no longer like the process used to be when you would have a search committee and everybody would come in and you'd have the dean of students represented, and a wide swath of the community of the campus would come in and try and select the next coach. You really don't have that anymore. What you have is a situation of triangulation. You have a situation where most coaches in their current contract are not permitted to speak to other schools about coaching vacancies. What that does is it creates a triangulation. So then you bring in a search firm, and the search firm is allowed to operate in the vacuum where the coach can't operate. They can express interest for the coach. They can express interest through the coach to the current school to see if there's interest, to see if they can proceed down the road. Most athletic directors at a school where you might lose your coach aren't really fond of giving permission to speak to other schools. It's something that's a rub in the business, and as you would probably, when we talk about Coach Pitino, you're probably going to talk about a buyout situation in that area where Iona had contracted with Coach Pitino and then put a buyout for him to leave the school for another job. There would be a significant buyout on that job. And when you say, Rich, where does the money for the buyout come? The buyout money usually doesn't come from the school. It usually comes from outside sources, boosters, alumni, and that's why you see that they have the significant amount of influence in the job search of anybody in the job search are usually the boosters and the alumni who donate money to the school. And so you don't have it usually in the traditional format. And so when we talk about St. John's, we get off the get-go with that job. their old coach, Mike Anderson. One of the things that I say about coaching when athletic directors, presidents are looking for coaches, what are you looking for in a coach? What is your criteria? I think one of the criteria that helps at a job like St. John's is that you have a criteria that surrounds the ability to recruit that geographic region prior to coming to St. John's. Mike Anderson had been a very successful coach at other places, but like Mike Jarvis when he came into New York City, he didn't know one single Catholic high school league coach. He didn't know any of the PSAL coaches that are all critical to the piece of what shakes up New York basketball. And if you're New York basketball and you're St. John's, they have to be tied together. And that's when St. John's has been in its most successful. When they had Chris Mullen, who was a Xaverian high school player, stay at home. When they had Omar Cook, Eric Barkley, Robert Wardan, my former player, who was an Archbishop Malloy player, stay home and attend St. John's.
It's almost like a homegrown farm system.
Exactly, and that's where St. John's has always been at its best. They have a roster that includes all different cities, all different states, but they haven't hired coaches that know how to control the area of which they live in. The 200-mile radius around St. John's is rich with talent. Now, does the talent get out or does the talent stay home? By hiring Rick Pitino, I think you just increased your chances of keeping the homegrown talent close to home than you have. And that paradigm in recruiting has shifted a little bit. When I was a young man, you had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and he was choosing UCLA because it was on the West Coast, as far possibly away from home as you could get. That was the metric of how well you did. How far did you go? That has changed a little bit now. And students are preferring to stay a little closer to home, to be a little closer to their home environment where they have their family able to attend a lot of their games and be a part of their career. So now you go back to Coach Pitino. He was at Iona, took them to the tournament. He's a storied Hall of Fame coach. And for St. John's to make the move, I think it was probably a little bit of a leap of faith. I think that there were a lot of people who said Rick Pitino is going to do a great job here. And then a lot of people also who said there's certain things that come along with Rick Pitino that we need to be ready for. And so I think that was probably some of the conversation that goes back and forth. But you'll have situations now where St. John's will no doubtedly most likely be involved with LeBron James's son as a recruit. Probably couldn't have got within 50 yards of that situation previous. Now you have Rick Pitino. You'll be involved with some of the best players in the country instantly because of Coach Pitino's connectivity to the NBA. He was an NBA former coach. He has a number of players that he's coached that are currently in the NBA, and a number of his former assistants. Billy Donovan is a head coach in the NBA. He was Coach Pitino's former assistant. So I'm going to give this an A-plus hire by the people at St. John's. I think it's a great hire for them because they're going to start to win now. And if you go back historically, Pete, St. John's has been down for a really, really, really long time. The last time St. John's was relevant in the national picture was a long, long time ago. And it's one of the most storied programs in the entire landscape of college basketball. But I think what it points to is also the football schools are dominant now, and the schools that didn't have the big-time football, such as St. John's, Seton Hall, those schools are under duress a little bit. And as far as being part of the national mainstream, I think that day kind of went by them a little bit, especially when the Big East didn't adopt football and didn't get into that profit-sharing model with football. But I think by hiring Coach Pitino, you've given yourself a great, great chance to come back. So let's move on to the second one we have picked up for you is Notre Dame. Notre Dame had Coach Mike Brey. And one of the things that we want to talk about here is on the vacating of these jobs. Excuse me, got a little frog in the throat today.
No worries. It's a little dry in here.
With the vacating of some of these jobs, you look at when they're changing hands the way they do, with such rapidity, you're looking at several of the jobs or a portion of the jobs that don't change hands for a really, really long time. Syracuse was in the hands of Jim Boeheim for 47 years. Coach Krzyzewski coached at Duke for 30 plus years. Roy Williams was at North Carolina for a really, really long time. So
But aren't those really good for recruiting and stuff like that? If your coach is going to be there and he's not going anywhere in like a year or two?
it's terrific for recruiting. It's one of the reasons that those schools have been as dominant and as great as they have. But it doesn't help younger coaches because the jobs that they're getting are the jobs that have proven not to be good jobs. And so that's what we want to talk about a little bit in this whole coaching thing is the job of St. John's used to be a fantastic basketball job. They had the Madison Square Garden as part of their profile, and New York City talent was unbelievable so that they could choose from. And so they had a great little niche there, a great little cachet. That's changed over the years, and also there's a number of different schools that also found out, like Frank McGuire did when he was the head coach at North and South Carolina, that you can build a pipeline to New York. If you hire the right assistant coaches, you bring in the right connection of people, you can build pipelines out of New York where you're going to be able to get 1, 2, 3, 4 players who can really, really significantly help your program. So we move on to Notre Dame with Mike Brey. Again, Mike Brey there a number of years. Probably get consideration for the Hall of Fame at some point. But they took the coach from Penn State, Micah Shrewsbury. Coach Shrewsbury had been at Penn State for 2 years. They made the NCAA tournament this year. But I think Notre Dame is one of the marquee jobs in the absolute whole sphere of basketball. I think Notre Dame is one of the great jobs there. And I think the selection of Coach Shrewsbury was because they knew they were changing coaches for a very long time. They knew that Mike Brey was not coming back for a very long time, so they had a really long time to make this selection. And to select somebody who's always only had 2 years of head coaching experience, I think it was a bad decision on Notre Dame's part. I'm going to give the hire a D. Penn State, in order to fill Micah Shrewsbury's shoes, went and hired Mike Rhodes from VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University. I like that hire. Coach Rhodes did well at Virginia Commonwealth, which is what we call a mid-major conference level program. And I think now stepping up to Penn State, he's qualified and well ready for the job. So I'm ready to give that one a B+. We jump into the Georgetown job, which again, like St. John's, was at one time one of the marquee jobs in the entire business. John Thompson had them in the top 10 perennially, and they were making a living just like St. John's was with very, very local players, with players who were within 200 miles of the campus. And so I think they had an interesting story there for different reasons. And again, into the hiring process, you've seen they've fallen and they've run into a little bit of difficulty. What happens also is I think Georgetown's going to find out a little bit. I hope Ed Cooley doesn't find this out as their new coach. But St. John's, when they fell, it took them an awful long time to get up. This is not like you can turn it around because Kentucky and Arkansas and Alabama are not going to stop running. They're not going to stop recruiting. They're not going to stop building their programs so that you can become better. So when you fall in this business, it's very, very difficult sometimes to get back up. Recruiting gets turned off. Why do players want to go to a program that has a history of losing? They don't. And other coaches, opposing coaches, are on the phone exactly telling them exactly that. They haven't made the NCAA tournament in years. They haven't made the NIT. That's the litany of things that coaches, they call it negative recruiting in that business. But in essence, it's basically just telling the truth. And if telling the truth creates a negative picture around your program, then that's not negative recruiting. That's just telling the truth about your program, and it happens to be negative. So when we go into the hire at Georgetown of Ed Cooley, I think they did a great, great job. I think Pat Ewing was a difficult hire. It was a popular hire at the time, like some of these hires are, and I think you saw it was a first-time job on a very, very high level. We talk about this all the time, and Coach Ewing had his troubles there. Coach Ewing had his difficulties, never having been a head coach, winding up with one of the top 50 to the top 100 jobs in the absolute country. I think it's a challenge. I think it's really, really difficult. And I think if you went back historically and looked at some of the numbers, I think you would find that the numbers on that situation is not very high as far as success. I think you'd run into a situation there where the numbers are actually fairly low. So Ed Cooley coming into Georgetown, I think is a terrific hire. I think that's a very, very strong hire for Georgetown. I'd give it a grade A. We move on to filling Ed Cooley's spot at Providence. Ed Cooley had been at Providence for a long time, lived in Providence, kind of a dream job. So I was a little bit surprised when he took the Georgetown job, but not entirely, because Georgetown is what it is and has potential to be what it is. And Providence is what it is and has the potential to be only what it is. And so I think the move for Ed was probably one where he felt like he had done everything he could at Providence and he wanted to make a change. Providence then went in turn and hired Kim English. Kim English is in the similar mode to the Micah Shrewsbury hire in that Kim English had been at George Mason for a very short period of time, had done okay there. The results weren't terrible. The results weren't great. But after 2 years, he jumps up and takes this job at Providence, which I think is a significant job and a very, very difficult job, and I'm going to give that hire a D.
Why would you leave a coaching job after 2 years? You barely get your feet wet by the in a 2-year time span. You don't even have a full recruiting class come through yet, and you're already leaving.
Right. So basically, any success you had was with somebody else's players
Right.
who left. But what also is the rub is now you're going into a situation where you haven't really demonstrated a successful level at that level. And that's all I'm asking for is we get some of these young men go into the jobs. Let them demonstrate proficiency at a level and then move up. But what we're having happen now is they're just kind of running around looking for people who have certain experiences, certain demographics. And I think it's going to create more job openings as we go through, not less. And so what we talked about, if you've been following the show since show 1, and we went through 2, 3, and now we're into 4, if you've been following the show since that time, I think what you're finding out is that we kind of set the table for some of this to happen. And now that it has, we can look at it in real time, and it kind of bears out and proves what we were talking about early on. And so Patrick Ewing's a good example of where he was a Georgetown player, one of their greatest players, if not the greatest player in school history. He coached in the NBA for a number of years, but he had never, ever been a head coach before. I think that's really, really difficult to do. I think that's really, really hard for people to do. So I want to give Ed Cooley grade. I want to give that an A. When we move to Providence, taking Kim English after 2 years, not having a ton of experience, I'm going to give that one a grade D. I really don't see what the accomplishment was there at George Mason. There was room to grow and get better there, and I think Providence probably panicked a little bit and made this decision based upon some of their boosters and trying to win the press conference rather than really going out and look at who's out there. When you go to Iona job now, Rick Pitino vacated the Iona job. We're excited to talk about this one because this young man is somebody I know and somebody I have great respect for. And he's a really, really good basketball coach, as evidenced by FDU's run through the NCAA tournament. But Tobin Anderson was a Division III coach, a Division II coach, and then became a Division I coach at FDU, wound up winning and doing very, very well in the NCAA tournament, and now takes the Iona job. That's the situation that I'm talking about that's most healthy for college basketball. Somebody who comes up through those ranks at different levels and is able to move through those ranks. So Tobin Anderson tells an interesting story during this whole thing, during his rise. And what he talks about during his rise was, I thought it was a really cool thing for him to do because he's a cool guy. And he says that he would talk to coaches, and his winning record when he was a Division II coach was off the charts. I'm talking 75 to 80% winning percentage.
Wow.
In Division II. It was off the charts. And he tells a story about him interviewing at Division I schools and the athletic director saying, Tobin, I love you. Tobin, I want you. But my boosters will go absolutely crazy if I hire a Division II coach. And that is just completely details the landscape of the hiring process in college basketball.
So they'd rather have a retread than a Division two?
Rather have a retread or a person who comes from a big name school or something like that to get the boosters excited. Now, let me just go a little bit deeper than that, though. When the boosters get excited, that means money comes into the school, though. When the boosters are excited about the new hire, they will donate. And so there is a reason to win a little bit of the press conference, but you also have to be a little bit concerned about the body of work. And I think Providence probably didn't get into the body of work of Kim English that deeply. And so when you say Iona goes and hires a young man who was from FDU, I think that's a good move up. I think that's a good move for Iona. I think it's a good move for Tobin Anderson. And if Tobin Anderson can keep Iona in the situation where they are, then maybe he should get another look at another time. But we really like when people are able to succeed and pay some dues. What also happens is with Tobin Anderson, there's a ton of other good coaches that are around there that are going to, like, for example, we had Dave Hickson, and I think he just made the Hall of Fame. Dave Hickson was a longtime coach at Amherst College, right over here locally, and a good friend of mine, and I believe that Coach Hickson, and I wanted to take this opportunity to say congratulations to Coach Hickson because I do believe he made the final list for the Hall of Fame and will be inducted into the Naismith Hall of Fame, which is absolutely critical for Division III. It's great for Coach Hickson. It's great for Amherst. But Coach Hickson had a different couple of looks at some different schools, at some Division I schools, and wound up never, ever being hired by those schools because of this stigma that sits over Division III and Division II. I think if ADs start to become a little bit more courageous in their hiring process and look at the body of work of some of the coaches, I think you will come out with a better result, and we won't have the carousel, as we call it, spin quite as wildly as they do. So I'm going to give the Iona hire a nice A-, B+. I think that was a really, really good situation with them. And then we can move a little quicker through some of these as well. Holy Cross locally lost their coach, Brett Nelson. They went and hired former Williams coach, former Bucknell coach, former George Mason coach, Dave Paulson. I'm going to give that one an A. Dave Paulson has been in the Patriot League. He knows his way around the league. He won a national title at Williams College, the national championship at Williams College. My friend John Krikorian down at Christopher Newport just won the national title as well at Christopher Newport. That is significant. On whatever level you're on, to have accomplished something of that magnitude is significant. And so Coach Paulson coming back to Holy Cross, that's an absolute grade A. I want to give Coach Paulson a shout out because I coached against him when he was at Williams. I think he's a good coach. I think he's a good man. And I think Holy Cross did a really good thing for themselves in getting Coach in there. And I think he'll turn that program around pretty quickly. So that's why it's an A. That's what we graded on. How quickly are they going to take their program? Because most of the coaches that they've had previously don't get fired for good reasons. They don't get fired because their level of success was so tremendous. So when you come in, you're usually coming into a situation where you have to take it from the bottom and then you have to move it up. And I think Dave Paulson's a really, really good guy to take that program, Holy Cross, a vaunted, wonderful program historically, and now try and get it recalibrated, try and get it removed up. They've moved it into the MAC tournament. They moved into the Patriot League tournament. It's been an up and down ride for them, but it's typical of another small Catholic school that was really successful in the landscape of college basketball many years ago. But just like St. John's and DePaul and some of the other schools, they seem to have lost their way a little bit. And a lot of that is because a lot of the Catholic schools don't have football. And so that affects their programs tremendously, and it's affected their basketball landscape because the football schools have just become bigger and bigger and have greater resources. So if we go into Manhattan College, Steve Masiello, this one I really, really don't get because they had almost the entire year to select a new coach. They fired Steve Masiello probably in the beginning of the season, maybe right into the season. So they've known from October, November that they needed a new coach. This thing dragged out and dragged out and dragged out. I don't know what they were thinking, but they went and hired John Gallagher, who was previously at Hartford. Hartford went to Division III, and Coach Gallagher decided not to stay with the program. and then wound up getting hired by Manhattan. I think that there's a lot of people out there that had different resumes that were better for the job. I'm going to give Manhattan. I grew up right next to it. I loved going to the Garden, watching Fordham play Manhattan, watching the Manhattan fans take the head off the Fordham Ram mascot and throw it around the bleachers in Madison Square Garden like it was a beach ball. I remember those days well, but Manhattan has really, really taken a step back. Coach Boeheim stepping down at Syracuse, Adrian Autry, the hire there, I'm going to give that a D as well. It's very similar to what I talk about. I love Adrian Autry, coached against him when he was a young man at Tallentine High School, but this is a really big job. They've kind of fallen off the map and need to get back up. I think somebody who's never coached before in their life is going to have trouble making that work. So you have Temple with Aaron McKee. They just went and hired Adam Fisher. I'm going to give that a grade D as well. Aaron McKee is still at Temple working there. He was one of their own players. I didn't think their program was in complete disarray under his direction. They did move conferences. They did make the job a little bit more difficult. I think as one of their own, they could have stuck with him a little bit longer. Adam Fisher coming off of Micah Shrewsbury's staff in Penn State and now taking this job. Certainly wish him well, but I think it's a grade D. VCU, Mike Rhodes, he left and he took the Penn State job, as we alluded to earlier. They brought back Ryan Odom. I think that's a pretty interesting hire. Coach Odom was the first coach ever as a 16 seed to beat a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament. He took the Utah State job, found out that there's not a basketball player within 1,000 miles of the state of Utah, and decided to come on back home to the area of Virginia. I think Virginia Tech is a really good job in the Atlantic 10. I think that's a pretty good hire for them as well. I'm willing to give that an A-.
Blackstone Valley is a nice, beautiful area to live in, too.
They have a good basketball, good basketball reputation there as well, because how do you know if it's a good basketball job? The way you can tell is how many coaches make it out. So if you look at the Xavier job, that's a job that springboarded many, many coaches up to better jobs. Skip Prosser was one of the coaches there. Pete Gillen was one of the coaches there. Sean Miller was one of the coaches there. They all went on to get better jobs. And then you look at other jobs like, say, Army just filled their job. They hired a young man by the name of Kevin Kuwick, who's an assistant at Butler. I think that is maybe one of the most difficult jobs in all of the 365 jobs, to be at a military institution, maintain Division I basketball. I think that's a really, really difficult job, and I think that's been a bit of a graveyard for coaches. There's not a lot of people since Mike Krzyzewski who's gone out of there successfully and gone on to other jobs. And so that's how I say it's a good job, bad job. That's how I flip the coin and say that's a good situation, that's a bad situation.
Yeah, but would you want to... Would there be a coaching situation where you get a young guy and he stays there for a decade or two or whatever and becomes the next Jim Boeheim because he stays there so long in a school like that?
Yeah, you want people to be comfortable. They're well compensated, the coaches,
right?
So when they move, but when they move, you also have to give consideration, because somebody said to me, we were at dinner when we were out just recently, and somebody sat across from me, and we were talking about the carousel, talking about all the coaches, and they said to me, why would he do that? It's always one of the things that comes up this time of the year. Why would a coach do that? And the answer to the question for me was very simple, because I was in the middle of my chicken franchise. So I just looked up simply and I said, double salary.
Okay.
They double their salary, most of these young men. So let's talk about Mike Rhodes, who is at VCU, probably making $1.5 million in that area. It's a good salary by any stretch of the imagination. But by taking the Penn State job, he probably doubled his salary to the $3 million range. And when you say to people, why would you do that? That's 1.5 million reasons why he would do that. He just increased his salary, increased his family's viability by $1.5 million. The second piece of it is when you're at VCU, let's walk it through on a game day, okay? You play at nighttime in the Atlantic 10, and now all of a sudden you have just finished the game, and you want to get your team back to Virginia as fast as you can. You're in Olean, New York, and you just played St. Bonaventure. So you have a 70-mile ride from the basketball arena to the airport. When you get through with the game, there really are no flights that are going to take you out commercially at that time of night. And so when you're at VCU, you're going to stay in the hotel the next night. You're going to get up in the morning, and then you're going to take the extra day. The students aren't going to be back in the classroom. And then you're going to fly back the next day, take the whole next day of you're not going to be able to practice. You're not going to be able to do a lot of things because they're going to be worn down a little bit. The Penn States of the world have private jets. They have private chartered jets at that big level. And so right after the game, no matter where they are, they get to the airport, they load that plane, they go home that night. They're back in their beds that night by midnight usually. And that's a tremendous advantage for the program as well. So when not only is it additional money that the coach gets, but it also becomes additional resources for the program. Instead of playing in front of 8,000 people, now you're playing in front of 18,000 people. Instead of having a booster club that had 200 people in it, now you have a booster club at Ohio State with 20,000 people in it. And so the resources become greater as well. So that's why they do it. But it's a risk-reward situation as well, because if you're looking at Patrick Ewing, he was at Georgetown for 4 or 5 years, and now he needs a new job. And so it's very volatile as well. And so that's why the carousel spins as wildly as it does. But when we talk about that, we talk about those top jobs rarely ever move. These bottom jobs are moving all the time. And so a coach goes in for 3 years, they fire him, comes out, and then they bring in a new coach. He lasts 4 years, they fire him, he goes out and go. So if you look at the history, Onyx, of St. John's program from the time of, say, Lou Carnesecca, you can look at a number of different hires that they made there that would make you scratch your head, and then look at what happened in the program, look at where they went from there, and it's pretty easy to draw a string to it to say they didn't hire the right people at the right time. So without further ado, Pete, I would love to climb into what's left of this bracket, what's left of the NCAA tournament. Before we get into it, I want to first overview that I've been watching the NCAA tournament as a very, very interested participant for many, many years. And this is one of the most exciting tournaments, I think.
It's one of the most crazy tournaments.
The
Holy
games
cow.
have been absolutely exciting. A lot of them have come down to last-second situations, and you're seeing some great coaching and some great plays. But I want to get off this start with a Noxzema shout-out. Okay, we talked about the Noxzema profile, about having a shot that just resonates. And if you look at this shot that we're going to talk about in the next second, you're going to see this shot played on NCAA trails coming into the NCAA tournament for the rest of time. This is an amazing, amazing end to the UCLA-Gonzaga game. Julian Strawther is going to get our Noxzema shout-out because, believe it or not, my coaching expertise tells me that although this happened on the fly and although this happened in transition, this was a self-designed, off-the-bench set play. This was not anything other than the Coach Few, saying, okay, here we go. We're at the last second. We're coming down the floor. I'm not going to call timeout. I'm going to just go with the flow here. And what they did was they turned around to their shooter, Julian Strawther, pitched it to him from behind because everybody else was in front, and he just trailed just that little bit, and he buried that shot and buried UCLA at the same time. And that was a great, great basketball game. It was so well coached, I thought, by both sides. But I also thought that the NCAA tournament, as we said before, is about making shots. It's about making big, big shots. And that allowed Gonzaga to move on, and I thought that was the shot of the tournament. So for Noxzema, we're going to give a shout-out to Julian Strawther. But let's get into it right now, Pete, with the Final Four that we have. Talk a little bit in depth.
All right, why don't we start in the West then with the Gonzaga, UCLA, and Gonzaga now a 14, what is it, a 3 versus a 4? Gonzaga versus UConn.
Yeah, so some of these games are already gone. And so the Gonzaga, we can talk about them posthumously. Gonzaga is done. They're cooked. I had them in my bracket moving up pretty far, but they ran into a UConn buzzsaw. This game, at a certain point of the game, was not even close anymore. Danny Hurley has his team playing at a very, very high level. They are extremely talented. And Gonzaga, as well, is extremely talented, but that game was dominated by UConn. And one of the things as we squeeze the bracket down and as we get into that Final Four, what I said to a good friend of mine the other day was, you might possibly, and this is no disrespect to San Diego State and no disrespect to Florida Atlantic, but I think on Saturday you're going to watch the final game in the semifinal, because I think this Miami UConn game, they're the two best teams in the tournament right now of the four, and I think they're going to play each other, bump each other out. And I think if they had their druthers over at CBS, they'd like to see Miami and UConn split up right now, because I was pretty adamant from the very, very beginning that I thought Miami took a bad shot when they got a 5 seed, but I thought they had the best backcourt in the tournament. It's proven to be that with Wong and with Isaiah Wong. And
so you think it's going to be a
Pack.
snoozer of a national championship game?
I don't, because we're going to talk about the other two teams on the other side, but they have impressed me as well, but for different reasons.
Okay.
They've impressed me as well, but for different reasons. So if you want to start off with UConn, we can start off with UConn, because they have a situation where they're going to play Miami right now. And you can take this game right now and isolate it and really take it down to a lowest common denominator of it's going to be big versus little. It's going to be guard play versus big play. And what I mean by that is you have Wong and Pack from Miami. They're both terrific guards, and they've been dominating the tournament, and they dominate the ball for Miami. You'll see them have the ball in their hands, I want to say upwards of 60 to 65% of the time. And then you look at UConn, and UConn has two tremendous big men inside with Donovan Clingan and Sonoga. And I think that if you're looking for a difference in the game, I think the size of UConn and their strength and ability inside could be a difference. But Miami's guards have been terrific. I think Miami will win the game, but I think UConn's going to really provide them with something that's very, 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 very different from what they've seen, because their inside people are as really, really good as they are. What I wanted to talk about in this game as well is because when you get this far, you have your basic star players who've carried you to this level. And then every once in a while, you get a player who's going to step in. And so for In the Zone fans out there, I'm going to give you a player from each team that I want you to keep an eye on. And I think that if there gets to be a point of the game where things get a little tense for UConn, or things get a little tense for Miami, you're going to see, because I've watched these two gentlemen during the year, and they rise to the occasion at some different times and have given their teams a lift. And I think if this comes true, the other team's really going to be in trouble. So for UConn, you have Joey Calcaterra. He's a 6'4", 6'5" shooter. He's come into the game at different times when UConn has been struggling and absolutely lifted the team with his play. He hustles all over the floor. He could really shoot the basketball, but he's capable of making plays as well. And for Miami's got the two-headed prong of Pack and Wong. They also have Norshord or Mir, who we've talked about on the show, who's a tremendous, tremendous big man inside and a future NBA player in my estimation. But I think Jordan Miller's been a bit of a difference maker for them. And both of those young men, the funny part about it, most likely came out of the portal, because with Calcaterra, he was at San Diego for 4 years, had a very good career out there. And Jordan Miller, I believe, is a George Mason transfer. And so there's a couple of the George Mason guys that are still around in this tournament that transferred in. So I think that those are two things I would keep my eye on if I was in that game. I think Miami will win the game. UConn's favored to win it. But I just think that this Miami team is clicking at the right time. Coach Larinaga, I give him the edge in terms of experience, in terms of the coaching selection there. But I think it's going to be a great game, and I think that is more of a final game than the other two, because these two teams have arrived here. You're looking at a Final Four without a number 1 seed. These two teams have arrived here through some grit and some kind of coming up through the shadows a little bit, where they weren't the name, that they weren't the name team, they weren't the team that everybody had in their bracket. And if anybody has all 4 of these teams in their bracket, they're probably going to be a millionaire at some point.
Yeah, how many? I don't remember the last time there hasn't been a number 1 or a number 2 in the Final Four.
It's been years. It's been years, and I think that also proves out some of the other stuff we've been talking about on the show here with the bigger schools have all the advantages with all the home games, with all the bye games. But when you get to the NCAA tournament and you just got to go mano a mano against the other team, then the other team has gone through everything they've gone through. And you see Florida Atlantic come up and play in one of the toughest brands of basketball you're going to see. I think what also could happen there is I think Dusty May might have won too many games in this tournament because he would have been the hottest coaching name of all the names that were out there right now. But what happened also is he's still playing, so he can't talk to any of the teams about their coaching position. The teams don't want to wait until he's done because now you're almost through the Final Four, and they want to have their coaching searches solved by Final Four if they can. And so Dusty May's gone all the way into the Final Four, but he would have been the hottest coaching name that was out there.
Will he be the big name for next year?
He certainly will be, but I wouldn't rule out the possibility that something else could happen. That would maybe bring Dusty May to a different place. I don't want to upset the Florida Atlantic people because I'm sure they're happy as can be with their coach. But I think that, let's say hypothetically, that Jim Larrañaga wins the national championship. Does he return to Miami if he does that? Or does he go out on top, a la Dave DeBusschere, New York Knick, win the title, and say bye-bye to everybody? It's a great way to go out on top, and people remember you tremendously that way.
Right. Makes a good case for your Hall of Fame.
And then Dusty May could easily slide down to the Miami job from Florida Atlantic. So from Boca to Miami, I'm not sure how far that is, but I don't think it's too far.
Not that far, no.
Yeah, I think he
could probably commute
he
on the Bright Line.
Yeah, and he's an amazing young coach and done very, very well. So I think that hypothetically that could happen. I don't have any information on that, but I if I was Coach Larrañaga, I'd give that some consideration. And if I was the people at Miami, I think I'd done very, very well if I could get Dusty May to come over and replace Coach Larrañaga, who has been on the Hall of Fame ballot this year as well. So if we slide over to the other bracket, you're talking about San Diego State and Florida Atlantic, and a lot of people are sitting there going, how did this happen? How did both of these schools get to where they are now to represent the Final Four? Because if you're looking from the TV perspective, TV usually likes big schools. They love Miami, they love Kansas, they love Duke, they love North Carolina in the Final Four. If you could pick a Final Four before the year started, if the NCAA people could pick a Final Four before the year started, they'd pick Kentucky, North Carolina, Duke, and maybe Florida.
I mean, look at the road for FAU. I mean, they beat some really, really good teams along the way.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's what I wanted to talk about. But what I also wanted to talk about was also how each one of those teams actually caught a little bit of a break in the selection because some of the teams that they played wound up being huge upsets. For example, San Diego State got to play Furman in the second round to move on to the Sweet 16 because Furman beat Virginia. So if San Diego State plays Virginia in that game, it's a little bit of a different game. But then they went on and beat Alabama, and they also went on and beat Creighton. They started off with a Charleston team that was really good too. So I think that San Diego State's had a decent road, coming in here. Now you go to FAU. FAU opened up with a big win against Memphis, but I don't know if you would call this a break, but they wound up with FDU in the second round instead of Purdue. And so that vaunted them into the Sweet 16 as well. And I think that was a huge break. Now, they beat Tennessee, and they beat a team that I thought was really loaded for the Final Four and all set to go in the Final Four. But
we both thought Kansas State would
Kansas State was really, really loaded up and good to go. But they wound up beating Kansas State because the intensity of their defense is tremendous. The intensity of their defense is tremendous. And if you look at San Diego State, what you're going to see in San Diego State is a balanced ledger sheet. They have guys that average 10 points, 8 points, 9 points, 7 points. That's how San Diego State breaks it out. They share the ball very well. Florida Atlantic does the same thing, but they have a little bit more of a star power there. But the one player that Florida Atlantic has that I think really, really deserves a little bit of a mention here is the big man inside, Mr. Golden. Okay, he's 7'1", 7'2", Russian player, and came to the country, transferred in from another school, but he is absolutely possible of changing the whole structure of this Final Four right here. Florida Atlantic plays tremendous defense. They get after it and spread the floor. They have great quickness so they can get around you and move on the dribble, but then they have this big 7'1" young man inside that's the exact opposite of Zach Edey. So Zach Edey's 7'3" for Purdue, and he's a Yao Ming type low pace center. He's going to be in the blocks. He's going to stay around the basket. He's going to use his size and his strength to do a lot of different things around the basket. Mr. Golden has the ability to do those things as well, but he can also step outside, and he is about as fluid and athletic as a 7-footer I've seen in some time. And so he's like Gumby a little bit because he's long and rubbery almost, and it's almost like rubber and glue. What bounces off of him sticks to you, and he's just been dominant at different places in this tournament. And that's a player that I think in a San Diego State game. Now, San Diego State's got two really good big guys inside. Don't get me wrong. And it's going to be a muscle versus a little bit of a finesse thing.
So you're saying that's another bigs versus defense type of
it could be
matchup.
But this young man, Golden, can change the scope of the game. He's that big and he's that dominant. Now, if San Diego State can get away with playing him physically and keep him away from the basket, I think they'll have some luck with it. But the passing on Florida Atlantic has been really good because they get the ball into him in really good spots. And he had some incredible dunks the other day where the defense just couldn't do anything with him. And so I think what that does is it gives you that inside-outside punch that people are wondering, how did Florida Atlantic get this far? They've been inside and they've been outside. They've been really punching with two different punches, whereas San Diego State, I don't think they're as versatile. And so if I had to pick somebody in this game, I think I'm going to pick Florida Atlantic because they've just been on such a great run. And they have that big kid inside that could really change the scope of this game. I don't know how San Diego State stops all of that perimeter action and stops him at the same time.
Yeah, because you got to concentrate on one or the other. If you double team them, they're gonna have a field day on the outside arc.
It's very, very difficult, very, very difficult to shut that down when you can do it in both ways. And so none of these teams so far have played much zone. And so they're basically man-to-man operation. And so I think that's going to be something to watch in that San Diego State game. I think Miami is going to beat UConn. I think Florida Atlantic is going to beat San Diego State, and it's going to create an all-Florida final. And I think that
bad for the ratings.
I think that's not going to help CBS because they like to have a wider audience.
Although on the flip side, I mean, the quality of the games this tournament might keep people interested for that type of thing.
I think when you get to the Final Four and you've had all of the games that they've played, I mean, you look at San Diego State beat Alabama. Many people had Alabama winning the national title. And what happened with Alabama was San Diego State was a bit of a buzzsaw for them because they didn't see them coming really. But what also happened with Alabama, in my estimation, was they lost the locker room. And so you're looking at Coach Oates, who's a great coach, but they have some of their players that were involved in some different stuff during the year that was very, very widely publicized.
True.
And as they started the tournament, the television pundits and the commentators, I was a bit surprised at the intensity and at the way they went at it right prior to the game when he was about to play, and they were talking about the incident that had happened with him and his friend, and they were involved in a situation that wasn't healthy. But I just thought
that became like this politically correct thing, and it affected. They're no longer talking sports; they were talking politics.
Yeah, and I think that affected their locker room because it became a distraction. And when you move into the NCAA tournament, you don't want to have too many different distractions. And when you see Kansas, Kentucky, Duke, North Carolina all get bounced out relatively early in this tournament, I think it proves out a little bit of what we've been talking about in that you're now seeing the landscape with the NIL, with the portal, with the rapidly changing rosters that can go left and right and up and down. I think you're going to see the landscape shift here in college basketball, and I think it's shifting in a direction away from some of those power conferences because They think they're going to be able to stay dominant with that. But right now, if you look at the Final Four, which is the greatest representation of the basketball year, who's left, you see that the power conferences have really, really been devastated. You'll see that the power conferences are very slimly represented in the finals of this tournament, and some of the great programs that they count on to be in this tournament for the prestige and to bring in the fan base and to make sure they have millions of people watch it. That's important. And so I think when you look at Florida Atlantic, does that cost you some viewers as opposed to having Kentucky in there or Kansas? I think it probably does. I think when you have San Diego State in there from a conference that's not one of the big power conferences, does that impact things? I think it probably does. And I think as much as they're trying to eliminate this, it came true for them anyway. As much as they were trying to eliminate the smaller mid-major teams, they were able to get those teams into a situation where they're just playing better basketball than the other teams are playing. And the amount of talent you have isn't always the winning factor. The amount of McDonald's All-Americans that you might have on your roster, that's not always the determining factor. If we could for a second also, we want to talk about, I'll give you a quick riddle, Pete. Okay. What happens to an elephant when it loses its relevance?
I have no idea.
It becomes irrelevant.
Oh, boy.
And that's exactly what happened to the NIT. If you could look and tell me North Texas and UAB are in the finals of the NIT.
University of Alabama, Birmingham. Right?
Alabama,
UAB?
Birmingham, and North Texas. And if you could tell me 5 players on each of those 2 teams, I'd be excited because I can't. And I watch basketball pretty heartily. But what they've done is they've moved it out of Madison Square Garden, moved it to Las Vegas because that's a corporate thing to do. That's what they sit around in a boardroom where everybody harumphs and there's no basketball people in the room, and they come up with decisions made like that. And they destroyed the history and the integrity of the NIT, and now, unfortunately, in my eyes and in many other people's eyes, I think I'll watch the final tonight and see how it goes, but in my eyes, the NIT has become irrelevant. NCAA tournament had a great year this year, but they're not looking at the marquee teams that they like to look at every single year, and so I think that's going to have a swing. You'll see how the reaction to all of that goes and see exactly what they do when it goes that way. But the last piece I wanted to do in the show today was because I think I was a little bit surprised that we have some viewership. There's some people that are watching us and they're communicating with me. And some of the viewership we have is young viewership. And they're playing basketball still. And they're still out there chasing the game and maybe trying to become a college player or make their high school team and do something of that venture.
Yep.
So I wanted to, because I was alerted to the fact that we do have some of those young people that are still playing the game. I want to offer up, and this goes for whether you're in biddy basketball, CYO, or you are Ben Simmons, Markelle Fultz, guys who are in the NBA, who are really, really struggling shooting the ball. Shooting the basketball is the most important skill in basketball. That's why Steph Curry is as good as he is in the NBA, because he's probably 6'2". I don't know how much of the dunking game he's in, but he's absolutely maybe top 3 player in the game right now because he can shoot the basketball better than anybody else can shoot the basketball. And when you look at some of the other players, like I mentioned Markelle Fultz, I use Ben Simmons as an example. There's different components to shooting, and the different components to shooting the basketball are both physical and both mental. And the physical piece of it involves having good form, having good touch with the ball, and being able to have what's called depth perception, see how far you are away and what's it going to actually take to get the ball to go that far. And so when you look at some of the gentlemen who are in the NBA playing for their entire lives, and you look at that situation and you say, wow, they're really struggling shooting the ball, you have to lean to the fact that that's become more of a mental issue than it has become a physical issue. And when we talk about shooting, I wanted to just offer up a drill that I used to do when I was a young player. And it's a really cool drill. And because you can't always get outside in the middle of winter in Massachusetts and get shots up on a rim outside, or you can't always get access to a gymnasium where you want to go in and get up some shots and really work on your jump shot. So shooting is something that's difficult to work on unless you're actually in the gym. I'm going to give you today, to close this show, I'm going to give all of the basketball players in the world, whether they're in the United States, Europe, anywhere around the world, all the basketball players in the world, I'm going to give you a great drill that I used to do that really helped me improve my shooting. Now, before I do and give you the drill, I want to just go out a full disclaimer. We like disclaimers on this show because it takes us and voids us of all responsibility. And so we love that. But what we're going to give you the disclaimer of is your mom and your dad are most likely not going to like this drill. Okay? My mom didn't like it at all. So here's the drill. You take a basketball and you lay down on your bed and you take your pillow off the bed so you can lay down as flat as you can possibly lay. And then you're going to have about maybe 6 feet. If you have the right ceilings at home, you're going to have about 6 feet between you and the ceiling. And what you do is you lay on the bed and you shoot the basketball all the way up to as close to the ceiling as you can get it without touching the ceiling. So you're laying flat on your bed, you're staring straight up at the ceiling, and you have your basketball in your shooting form, and you're getting ready. And so you then just practice taking that shot only up to the top of where you can reach it, almost right to the ceiling. But if you touch the ceiling, you have to get up, get out of bed, and do 10 push-ups. Okay, that was a drill I used to do it myself. Now, every time I hit the ceiling, my mom went crazy because the basketball left marks on the ceiling. And so if you're going to do this, you might be willing to also paint the ceiling, because you're going to might be leave some marks up there that mom and dad aren't going to be so healthy with. But the real trick is you want to make sure the ball doesn't touch the ceiling. And so what it does is it creates touch, and it creates the ability for you to figure out how I manipulate this ball in order to get it certain distances. It's not the same thing as shooting on a rim. It's not the same thing as getting out there and working with a basket and having a coach and some other people out there talking to you. But it will help you with your form, because it's difficult to move the rest of your body from there. And so it'll just be more your arm and your hands and that action. And that's really what you want when you're shooting the basketball, is working on that follow-through action. So that's the drill for today. Again, I want to leave everybody with the note of be nicer to everybody, be nicer to yourself. And when we come in and around Westfield, this is one of the greatest cities in all of the United States. Let's make sure everybody knows that, and let's make sure we keep it that way. Take care, Pete. I'll see you next week.